Hello and welcome back everyone. We are Playground Pigeon and this is the third devlog of our upcoming game, The Wake. Right now we are hard at work on our demo for the game, but we also want to keep you in the loop about the project. There is still a lot to tell until the devlogs will have caught up with the status quo of our current development, so let's make some mileage, shall we? The last time we left off, Maurin and I implemented a lot of things, such as inventory and storage systems, a journal, and a good portion of the landscape. At that point, we were more familiar with the engine and acquired a certain know-how, so we felt fit to actually work on the prototype and test it out. After all, the best looking game will be nothing without a good gameplay loop. As mentioned briefly before, beside exploration, the other two gameplay pillars would be fishing and fighting. These were meant to share a lot of aspects between them to allow for synergies and a player-friendly transition between the different gameplay states. Fishing and fighting would both be done on the water and thus also on the boat. They would also share a very similar user interface and share some vital resources such as magic powers and consumables. And while your main abilities would differ depending on whether you are fishing or fighting, inputs and the core loop would be the same also. Avoid getting hit and deal damage to enemy. Also, both would be done in a confined arena that would spawn on triggering the fight and despawn on ending it. Okay, let's look at it one by one. Fighting. The core gameplay was supposed to be inspired by horde shooters. I always love the aspect of space and weapon management these games bring to the table. It's high-octane strategic gameplay. At the same time, I wanted to make the fight meaningful. A lot of these games tend to just throw a million enemies at you, and I get the allure. It's a great feeling to see a lot of enemies pop at once, but it makes the targets themselves a lot less meaningful. We opted for less enemies at once that would be stronger and fill a critical role in the fight. Target priority was supposed to be a big thing with our fights. Say, you would be chased by 5 grunts, then a healer spawns. Do you keep focusing the grunts or do you switch target? The obvious answer is switching. Otherwise, the grunts won't die, more will spawn in the meantime, and they overwhelm you. Game over. By having multiple enemy types with different abilities, we form a natural target priority that changes dynamically depending on what happens on screen and when you are on the battlefield. Also, weapon choices would have to be made strategically. They all needed to excel at their own niche. The damage they bring to the table would only be half of it. The shotgun, for example, would be strong, yes, but it also pushes enemies away from you to clear a path forward when you are in a pinch or faced with fast enemies you might not be able to outswim without the knockback effect of the shotgun. The crossbow is a great all-rounder, dealing less spread and more focused damage if an enemy needs to die quickly. It also has a good amount of range, but it also deals extra damage to heavily armored enemies. These would have to be focused with the crossbow first and then finished with a weapon of your choice. Of course, it was important to us to encourage smart choices, but not to force them necessarily. You can always play your way, even if that might prove to be much more difficult than it has to be. So much for theory. Now, I had to implement all this in practice. I started out with an enemy AI. I made a character parent class and gave it all the functionalities that the enemies would share amongst them, such as a health pool, armor values, damage, speed variables, and dropped items. Movement would be individual since some enemies are static and others move actively. At this point we did not have enemy models yet, so I stuck to the Unreal Engine Many. I also made the first gun. Well, actually the first projectile that would launch from the player. The crossbow is the first weapon you get, so I made a bolt projectile and gave it a Niagara and a hit effect. After tinkering with the effects ourselves for a long while, we bit the bullet and bought this asset pack. It's just way too good and really gave our weapons the stylized look we wanted. Shooting it was a bit of a challenge though. Like all good top-down shooters, the character would rotate with the stick, or in this case with the mouse. Mouse points at location X, player rotates to location X. I made a hit on mouse location function and told the character to look at that point continuously. Now, when I press shoot, the projectile flies in the look at direction. The Brute Child class was supposed to spawn in, wait a small moment, and then swim towards the player non-stop. Upon reaching them, they deal damage. Pretty simple. I told the AI to move towards the player, implemented overlap events, and made it so that the actor faces the player at all times. I created a health bar that would show on hit and hide after a while to prevent visual clutter. Upon reaching 0 health, the enemy dissolves, splatters some blood, and drops their loot. Awesome. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, I made more enemies and more guns, mostly true to the concept arts I had made in the planning phase. I will probably introduce these to you in the future. You can also join our Discord for some sweet little updates every now and then. Over there, we discuss these things in more detail, and you can directly ask questions or make suggestions on the topics at hand. But for now, let's move on. Next step was to design the arena and its spawn functionality. I taught myself more about Niagara systems and made a swirling shadow barrier that served as the arena bounce. It is impenetrable for the player and their magic, and the center of that arena would always spawn at player location to ensure they are inside when the fight begins. The barrier actor itself would also serve as the enemy spawner that spawns the different AI classes in its bounce and in random numbers and assortments to ensure a level of unpredictability. I also made a difficulty variable that would be set on story milestones. Enemy numbers and HP would scale with this variable. Also, Maurin made the UI that would be constructed upon entering the fight. The button binding was still a bit messy and we were figuring out the best course of action. This was due to the fact that we would also have a whole different set of buttons that would need to be triggered fast and responsively. The magic. To spice the fights up and to give the player an edge in combat, magic would play a big role in it. A face dash would enable you to quickly zap from one point to another to evade enemies or collect vital power-ups. A shield would, shield you from damage. A shockwave push enemies away and stun them to give you room to breathe. And lastly, a buff you can trigger to boost your damage and the negation for a while. These would function on a recharging resource bar, and they can be upgraded with a specific resource to give them more niche utility and powerful upgrades. The dash, for example, would stop at enemies first, which means you have to aim it carefully in a fight or it would actually bring you in danger instead of away from it. With the upgrade, you can now dash through enemies, and another upgrade adds a lifesteal when you dash through a foe. The default shield is just a short mitigation. Upgrade it and it will deflect damage back to enemies and even give you speed boost to escape from danger when the duration ends. And yes, I had to sit through countless Niagara tutorials to learn about the effects I was trying to achieve. The ones by CG How helped me out the most. I quickly got the hang of it and I was able to make my own emitters and pretty cool stylized special effects. But back to the fights again. Now, how would fights actually be triggered? My initial impulse was to go the RPG route. There would be enemies in the water that chase you, and on contact a fight would trigger. But given the camera perspective, it was just too easy to run into another enemy close by that you could not see. Also, I deemed it best to have them spawn in and out on a day reset in random locations. But that would also mean possibly empty areas and others teeming with too many patrol enemies. And if I made them less punishing, slow, and with a low trigger radius, the player could avoid fighting way too easily and for way too long. My solution was something entirely different. I made enemy spawners, portals, so to speak. These would periodically appear on the map and spawn brutes every now and then that would seek out the player across the map. Multiple of these portals can spawn over time, spawning more and more enemies. They would not trigger a full-on arena though and serve as a nuisance rather, disrupting your exploring and fishing. Basically, if you did not remove these spawners, the amount of enemies would overwhelm you and keep you from doing anything in peace. As a reward for taking care of these crystals, they would give you valuable resources for crafting, upgrading, and leveling your magic. On interacting, they shatter, triggering a full-on fight with arena and special enemies. Think of God of War and its realm tier encounters. As a nice byproduct of this solution, the player is rewarded for fighting, so the motivation is also intrinsically, and they can tend to other things in peace after destroying a crystal without having to fear another attack. Of course, this means that the player would get a strong feeling of security once there are no crystal spawners present on the map. This was not what we wanted, obviously, and we quickly introduced another mechanic that would take good care of that. I will go in depth about all of this in the next devlog. So, at this point we had 7 working weapons and 5 different enemy types. Upon playtesting, we deemed the combat loop pretty fun, especially with all the interactions of magic, weapons, and enemy types and their priority. Our concept was working, well, at least for us. From there, our fishing combat would be built. You now know the basics of the combat system, and we encourage you to write down your first impressions in the comments. What do you like about it? What do you dislike? Would you like us to introduce the weapons and enemies in more detail? We are grateful for all your feedback and especially for the time you take to watch our videos. Please help us to grow this channel and our little community. It means a great deal to us if you subscribe to our channel and to our Discord also. Like I said, we post weekly updates and concept art and answer your questions and suggestions for the game. I can't stress enough how much of an encouragement your engagement is to us. After all, we want to make the best version of our dream game for you. We hope to see you next time, and we wish you all a good start into the new year. Please be kind to yourselves, and as always, follow your dreams.